The ballroom was elegant in the way corporate spaces always are. Too much glass, too much light, and just enough warmth to feel human. Gold and white banners hung from the walls, each one congratulating me on 40 years of service. A legacy of leadership, they said. A career that shaped generations. People smiled when they spoke to me, the polite kind of smile you perfect over decades in business. Former colleagues shook my hand. Junior executives thanked me for mentorship I barely remembered giving. Glasses clinked. Applause rose and fell in waves. And yet, I felt strangely distant from it all. This was supposed to be my moment, the end of a long career, the beginning of rest. Instead, it felt like watching someone else's life from a few steps away. I spotted my stepdaughter, Emily, standing near the edge of the room. She looked flawless, tailored dress, perfect hair, confidence radiating from every movement. She was scrolling on her phone, laughing quietly at something on the screen, detached from the celebration happening in her honor just as much as mine. When she finally approached, it wasn't with a hug. She leaned in close enough that her smile never faded for the cameras. "Now that you're retired," she whispered, her tone casual, almost bored, "you're on your own." For a second, I thought I had misheard her. I searched her face for sarcasm, for humor, for anything that would soften the words. There was nothing, just certainty. She straightened, patted my arm as if she'd offered advice, and walked away to rejoin her friends. The applause started again. Someone had tapped a microphone for another speech. I stood there, frozen, holding a glass I hadn't tasted. 5 minutes later, my phone vibrated in my pocket. The screen lit up with a name I hadn't expected to see that night. CFO. I stepped away from the crowd as the music swelled behind me and answered the call. And that was the moment my retirement truly began. People often assume success comes from ambition alone. It doesn't. It comes from sacrifice. Quiet, unrecorded sacrifice that never appears on resumes or retirement banners. I met Emily when she was 12 years old. Her father, my husband, had lost his wife only a year earlier, and grief had turned his home into a place filled with silence and unfinished conversations. Emily carried that grief like armor. She didn't trust easily. She didn't smile for strangers. And she certainly didn't want another woman stepping into her life. I never tried to replace her mother. Instead, I became something safer, consistent. I attended school meetings her father couldn't leave work for. I stayed up late helping with assignments she pretended not to care about. I paid for tutors when her grades slipped and pretended not to notice when she skipped classes anyway. When she got into trouble, I handled it quietly. When opportunities came up, I used my name to open doors she never knew were locked. Internships, scholarships, recommendations. Every advantage she had later, I helped place beneath her feet. Her father saw it. He used to tell me, "She'll understand one day." I believed him. After he passed, Emily and I were left alone in a house full of memories and unspoken expectations. I didn't leave. I stayed because family, to me, wasn't conditional. As my career grew, so did her lifestyle. I paid for university without loans, covered rent when she wanted independence without responsibility, smoothed over mistakes that could have ended careers before they started. I never kept score, because love isn't supposed to be transactional. But standing in that ballroom, hearing her say I was on my own, I realized something painful. She had been counting, and to her, I had already paid my final installment. Emily's words stayed with me long after she walked away. "You're on your own." Not shouted, not whispered in anger. Said the way people state facts they believe are settled. I stood there while another executive praised my leadership at the microphone. People applauded. Someone joked about golf courses and long vacations. I smiled at the right moments, but inside, my thoughts were no longer in the room. I kept replaying the past, searching for warning signs I had dismissed too easily. There had been moments. The way Emily stopped asking how I was doing and only asked what I could do for her. The way my advice became outdated the moment she no longer needed my connections. The way gratitude quietly disappeared once expectation took its place. I remembered her graduation day. She had hugged her friends, posed for photos, celebrated loudly. When it came time to thank me, she gave a quick smile and said, "I couldn't have done it without support." Support, not love, not family, a resource. Standing in that ballroom, I realized that's how she had always seen me, not as someone to stand beside, but as someone to stand on. That understanding hurt more than her words ever could. My phone vibrated again in my hand. I hadn't checked it yet. Part of me already knew that whatever was waiting on the other end of that call would confirm what I was beginning to accept. This chapter of my life wasn't ending because I had retired. It was ending because I had finally been dismissed. I stepped out of the ballroom and into the quiet hallway, the applause muffled behind thick doors. The carpet absorbed my footsteps as if the building itself wanted to keep secrets. "Are you alone?" my CFO asked the moment I answered. That question alone told me this wasn't a courtesy call. "Yes," I said. There was a pause. Papers shifting. A careful breath. "We discovered something this afternoon," he said. "It involves accounts that should have been dormant once your retirement paperwork was filed." I leaned against the wall, suddenly aware of how cold the marble felt through my dress. "What kind of accounts?" I asked. "Authorization-linked accounts," he replied. "They're still active. And transactions were approved using credentials tied to you, after your official retirement timestamp." My mind moved faster than my body. "That's not possible," I said quietly. "I no longer have access." "I know," he said. "Which is why I kept digging." He lowered his voice. "The access trail leads to a secondary profile. A personal trust account." The name he said next landed heavier than Emily's words had. "Emily registered it last year," he continued. "Listed as an authorized beneficiary. But the permissions, they shouldn't have been there." I closed my eyes. The ballroom lights flickered faintly through the glass doors. Inside, someone laughed. "Are you saying my stepdaughter has been moving company funds?" I asked. "I'm saying the board needs to know," he replied carefully. "And I needed you to hear it first." I thanked him and ended the call. For a long moment, I didn't move. 5 minutes earlier, I had been told I was on my own. Now I understood exactly what that meant, and why the call had come when it did. I went back into the ballroom with the same calm smile I had worn all evening. No one noticed the shift. That's the strange thing about moments that change your life forever. They rarely announce themselves. The music continued. Glasses refilled. Another colleague hugged me and joked about finally escaping corporate politics. If only they knew. I didn't confront Emily. Not that night. Not the next day. Because confrontation gives people time to prepare excuses. Silence, on the other hand, makes them careless. Over the next week, I did exactly what everyone expected of a newly retired executive. I cancelled meetings. Declined invitations. Let people believe I was settling into a quieter life. Behind the scenes, everything was moving. The CFO and I spoke through secure channels. Auditors were brought in quietly. No announcements, no rumors. Every transaction was mapped. Every approval time-stamped. Patterns began to emerge, and patterns don't lie. Emily, meanwhile, did what she always did. She spent. New furniture. Weekend trips. Designer purchases charged to accounts she assumed were invisible. She had lived too long believing the system existed to support her. And I let her believe it a little longer. People think revenge requires anger. It doesn't. It requires patience. Each morning, I poured my coffee and reviewed reports like I always had, calmly, methodically. The difference was that this time, I wasn't protecting anyone. I was finally protecting myself. What began as a suspicion quickly turned into a map. The auditors worked quietly but efficiently. Numbers don't get emotional. They don't lie to protect anyone. They simply reveal what's already there. The transactions followed a rhythm, small at first, carefully spaced, designed to avoid attention. Consulting fees that didn't consult. Expense reimbursements tied to events that never happened. Approvals routed through layers Emily knew most people wouldn't question. She hadn't been reckless. She'd been confident. And confidence is dangerous when it's built on the belief that someone else will clean up the mess. The CFO called me one evening, his voice steady but heavy. "It's worse than we thought," he said. "She's been leveraging your name, your reputation. People assumed the approvals were legacy permissions you forgot to revoke." I felt something tighten in my chest, not anger, not even betrayal. Disappointment. For years, I had shielded her from consequences, corrected mistakes quietly, used influence to soften hard landings. Now she was using that same shield as a weapon. Legal counsel advised patience. "Let her continue," they said. "Patterns strengthen cases." So I waited. Emily continued spending, unaware that every transaction was being logged, categorized, preserved. Each one added weight to a file she didn't know existed. I didn't intervene. Because this time, stopping her wouldn't teach her anything. Letting the truth surface would. I chose a public place on purpose. A quiet restaurant near the financial district, elegant, neutral, and controlled. The kind of place where people instinctively lower their voices. Emily arrived 10 minutes late, sunglasses still on, confidence untouched. She leaned in for a quick hug, the kind that feels rehearsed rather than sincere. "You sounded serious on the phone," she said, sitting down. "Everything okay?" I waited until the waiter took our order and walked away. Then I placed the folder on the table between us. It wasn't dramatic. No slam. No tension-filled pause. Just a thick, neatly organized file. Tabs visible, pages aligned. Years of discipline bound together. Emily laughed softly. "What's this?" "More retirement paperwork." "Open it," I said calmly. She did. At first, she skimmed. Then her eyes slowed. Her fingers tightened around the pages. Dates. Account numbers. Authorization trails. Her smile faded, not suddenly, but gradually, like color draining from a photograph. "This isn't what it looks like," she said quickly, before I spoke. "I know exactly what it looks like," I replied evenly. "And so does the board." Her confidence cracked. "You don't understand how these systems work anymore," she said, trying to regain control. "Those accounts were still active. Anyone could have." "No," I interrupted gently. "Only someone who knew how to use my name." She went quiet. The silence she had used on me for years finally belonged to her. I slid one last page across the table. "The accounts are frozen. Your access has been revoked. Compliance has escalated this beyond internal review." Her hands began to tremble. "You could have warned me," she whispered. I looked at her steadily. "You told me I was on my own." The words landed hard. For the first time, Emily wasn't ahead of the situation. She wasn't controlling the narrative. She was simply facing consequences, without a safety net. I stood, placed my napkin on the table, and spoke quietly. "This is where my involvement ends." I walked out, leaving her seated among strangers, surrounded by people, yet completely alone. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It never does. At first, it came quietly, like a shift in air pressure before a storm. Emily stopped answering my messages. Not because she was angry, but because she was busy. Busy calling lawyers. Busy contacting former colleagues who suddenly weren't available. Busy trying to understand how quickly doors could close when the name protecting her was no longer standing behind her. 3 days after our lunch, the board made its move. Her access was officially terminated. Company-issued devices were seized. Travel accounts frozen. Benefits suspended. Every privilege she had taken for granted vanished in a single afternoon. There was no dramatic announcement. Just absence. Her name removed from internal systems. Her office cleared after hours. Her projects quietly reassigned to people who didn't ask questions. The company's legal team contacted external authorities the same day. That part moved faster than Emily expected. She called me that night. Not confident. Not sharp. Crying. "I made mistakes," she said through broken breaths. "But it wasn't supposed to go this far. You know I never meant to hurt you." I listened without interrupting. I just need you to say something, she pleaded. One call. One statement. You still have influence. I closed my eyes, not in anger, but in recognition. For the first time, she wasn't asking for help. She was asking for cover. You told me I was on my own, I said quietly. So I respected that. The silence on the line stretched. Heavy. Final. When the investigation became public, the media never mentioned my name. That was intentional. The company had protected its legacy. Emily didn't get that protection. Friends stopped calling her. Invitations disappeared. The lifestyle she had built on borrowed authority collapsed under its own weight. Apologies arrived late. They always do. And by then, consequences were already in motion. Faster, heavier, and impossible to stop. I didn't attend the hearings. That surprises people when they hear the story. They expect me to sit in the courtroom, arms folded, watching justice unfold like a performance meant just for me. But I stayed away. Not because I was afraid to face her, but because I no longer needed to. The truth doesn't require witnesses once it's been documented. The numbers spoke. The timeline spoke. The approvals, the transfers, the intent, everything Emily had assumed was invisible now existed in black and white. I followed the case the way I used to follow quarterly reports. Calmly, objectively, through summaries from legal counsel, through quiet updates from the CFO, through headlines that avoided names but described circumstances clearly enough for anyone in our world to understand. Emily tried to reach me again. Emails this time. Longer. More careful. Written the way people write when they finally understood the seriousness of their situation. She apologized, not just for the money, but for the words she had spoken that night at my retirement party. She said she hadn't realized how much I had done for her. How much she had relied on my presence without acknowledging it. I believed her. But belief doesn't undo damage. Regret doesn't reverse decisions. The court proceedings moved quickly. Too much evidence. Too clear a pattern. Too many signatures tied back to her actions. What struck me most wasn't the verdict. It was the silence around it. No dramatic defense. No public support. No family stepping forward to soften the outcome. She had built her life assuming I would always stand behind her. When I stepped away, there was nothing left to hold her up. People asked me if I felt vindicated. I didn't. I felt something quieter. Heavier. Acceptance. The kind that comes when you finally stop carrying responsibility that was never meant to be yours. And as the case closed, so did a chapter of my life. One defined not by revenge, but by release. Months passed. Not in chaos. Not in regret. In quiet. The kind of quiet I had spent decades postponing, always promising myself I would slow down after the next quarter, after the next deal, after the next crisis. Retirement finally gave me what ambition never could. Space. I moved out of the city. Not far, just enough to hear the ocean instead of traffic. Each morning, I walked along the shoreline with no agenda, no phone vibrating with urgency. The sun rose whether I watched it or not, and for the first time, that felt comforting rather than threatening. I stopped measuring days by productivity. I measured them by peace. People from my former life reached out occasionally. Some out of concern. Some out of curiosity. A few hoping for guidance. I offered advice when asked, but I no longer rescued anyone from their consequences. That chapter was closed. Emily's name came up less and less. Not because I had forgotten her, but because I no longer needed the reminder. Forgiveness, I learned, doesn't require reconciliation. It only requires letting go of the need to fix what someone else broke. One afternoon, my phone rang. For a moment, I felt the old instinct, the tightening in my chest, the expectation of crisis. Then I looked at the screen and smiled. It wasn't a problem. It was a friend inviting me to dinner. I declined, not because I was busy, but because I wasn't. I watched the tide roll in instead. That night, sitting on my porch, I thought back to the words Emily had spoken at my retirement party. You're on your own. She had meant them as abandonment. But she was wrong. They became my freedom. Retirement didn't leave me alone. It gave me back my life.